Ellen Watkins Harper is an early Unitarian who doesn't get enough attention. When I first met my dear husband at General Assembly in Minneapolis 16 years ago, he was just about to start his parish internship in Vancouver, BC. And one of the first things I learned about him is that he loves Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, a suffragist, orator, and poet. I mean, Joe loves her. For him, a cis man who majored in women's studies and Protestant movements of the 19th century, she is like a superhero, mentor, and grandmother all rolled into one. She was born in Maryland in 1825. Her parents were free, but they died when she was just 3 years old, after which time she was raised by relatives in the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the AME. Her uncle, William Watkins, ran the Academy for Negro Youth, where Frances received an excellent education in the classics, a rarity for that time. After she graduated, the Fugitive Slave Act forced the closure of the school, so her uncle moved to Canada, and she went north, where she taught, without much satisfaction or success, honestly. Polly Peterson, in a 2010 book called Stirring the Nation's Heart, 18 Stories of Prophetic Unitarians and Universalists of the 19th Century, wrote, while she considered what to do next, events in her home state gave her a new aspiration. Maryland passed a law saying that any free person of color who entered the state would be arrested and sold into slavery. Frances Watkins heard about a young man who unwittingly crossed into Maryland and was sold to a Georgia slaveholder. He escaped but was recaptured and sent back to Georgia, where he soon died. Upon that grave, Watkins wrote to a friend, I pledged myself to the anti-slavery cause. Abolitionist newspapers all over the country at the time were opposing slavery, but especially in New England, where she was often featured as a columnist and speaker, she connected with transcendentalists and Unitarian abolitionists who invited her into their pulpits. New Englanders in those days didn't care much for women speakers, or honestly, black speakers, for that matter, but she was unusual being both. So she drew crowds, speaking repeatedly on the education and elevation of the colored race. And they must have liked her because the reviews of her speeches were always glowingly positive. She got engagement and she got pushback. And that was her goal. In 1858, while traveling the lecture circuit, she famously refused to give up her seat on a trolley in Philadelphia, 97 years before Claudette Colvin and Rosa Parks did the same thing in Montgomery. In 1860, she married Fenton Harper, who was twice widowed with 3 very young children. Then the Civil War broke out, and in 1862, she had her only child, Mary. Frances continued writing and lecturing, traveling the Free States, and supporting the family while Fenton farmed until his death, less than 4 years after their wedding. She was left financially destitute. Her stepchildren went to live with their families, and she raised Mary on her own, continuing to lecture while publishing. In 1866, at the National Women's Rights Convention in New York, fighting for the inclusion of black women, she gave a speech in which she coined the phrase, "We are all bound up together." She settled in Philadelphia, where she affiliated with the Unitarian Church, but on Sundays she was at the AME, her true home, teaching the Bible to children. Over the next quarter century, she published many books, including the nonfiction Sketches of Southern Life, an acclaimed novel called Iola Leroy, and a collection of poems, Yearning for the Forest Leaves. She was literally the first black woman to be published in multiple categories of writing. She joined the Women's Christian Temperance Movement and was one of the founders of the National Association of Colored Women. She was always seeking and pointing out intersections of identity, making place for Black women in the women's movement and white women in the struggle for equality. In her work, she drew on nature for metaphors, rivers as symbols of freedom and change, barren landscapes and trapped animals representing slavery, wintertime for death and isolation, springtime for new beginnings, violent storms illustrating the chaos of her times. Heavenly landscapes were common images. In one poem, she used the image of a grain of sand to represent her own faith. She reasoned that if God cares for the smallest parts of nature, then he cares for the oppressed. She wanted to humanize the oppressed in the minds of the middle-class white people whose attention she had gained across the country. She wanted to shine a bright light on the contrast between the beauty of the natural world and the ugliness of the unnatural state of slavery, and the connection between nature and justice. Maybe that's why we Unitarian Universalists like to claim her as one of our own, even though really her heart and community were with the AME Church. You know, there's always been this idea floating around Unitarian Universalism that we'd be better off if we looked more like the rest of the country, if we had the same kind of racial and ethnic makeup as the country at large. The idea is that the whole country would be better off if we weren't so white, because that would mean our principles and values are more widespread. And that would benefit everybody, right? The thing is that at various times in our history, even if it hasn't been taught to us, there have been plenty of Black Unitarians. And Mark Douglas Morrison Reed says it's important that we know that. In the 18th century, white abolitionists in the Northeast, many of whom were Unitarian or Unitarian adjacent, welcomed into their pulpits and homes Black public figures, not just Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, but also people like Frederick Douglass, who in turn drew more Black folks in. Even if they weren't active in Unitarian congregations, they nominally became members. In the 20th century, during the civil rights movement, integration was in vogue among liberals. Integration in every aspect of public life, not just schools. So Black folks came to Unitarian congregations and were welcomed into not just membership, but leadership. Every congregation sought to have a Black person on the board, preferably in a high visibility role of president. And both of those periods ended because of a simple truth. Virtue signaling and tokenism never really work out in the long run. Meanwhile, there haven't been so many Black Universalists, partly because a lot of the leadership of the faith in the 19th century and into the 20th century were unapologetically racist. And partly there weren't a lot of Black Universalists because of our theology. Right around the time that Mrs. Harper was born, the biggest theological debate in Universalist history exploded over the grace of God and the existence of hell. I won't get too deeply into it, but the debate was won by the ultra-Universalists who believed that there is no hell and that no sin is so great that it would cause separation from God, because God so loves all his creation. Amen. But think about that for a minute. Seriously, think about it for a minute. Through the lens of someone who was enslaved. Everybody gets to heaven together. So the formerly enslaved are in heaven side by side with their enslavers. And the worst, most brutal enslavers enjoy the favor of an all-loving God, just like those he tortured. Universalism, sadly, isn't particularly appealing to people who feel like, I'm sorry, universalism, sadly, is most appealing to people who feel like they don't really have anything to feel guilty about. It kind of limits our potential reach theologically. You know, especially if you come from an identity group that's been so oppressed for so long. And so Mark Morrison Reed says that it's important we know this so that we don't repeat history. It's important we know this so that if we ever get the chance again, we don't push away the very people we claim we want in our midst. Reverend Reed suggests that not knowing this history makes it easier for us to just trust the old adage that our style of worship, head-centered and honoring nature and humility over God, is the reason we don't have more black folks on our pews. But the truth is, we had lots of opportunities to have different outcomes, and we kind of kept blowing it. My feeling is that had the theological debate among universalists actually included black folks, perhaps the universalists would have settled into a different kind of faith statement with a different, more nuanced understanding of sin and evil, heaven and hell, suffering and oppression. My feeling is that if the Unitarians had actually seen and acknowledged and supported the black lady leaders and ministers present, like really invested in their shared future, we'd have a lot more people of color today in our midst. Unitarian culture may have evolved with black culture into something different from what we actually have. If their theology had been able to take into account the black experience of slavery, the Universalists may have been able to be more universally appealing. Those two churches, had they had more inclusive history, once they consolidated into Unitarian Universalism, might seem more relevant to the black experience today. But we've been centering whiteness among so many other hegemonic identities for so long now that part of me wonders if it's too late. I wonder if the divides across race, class, and education are so great that they can't be bridged significantly in great numbers into anything usefully harmonious or relevant to the world today. Who knows? It's a lot to ask, right? And there's nothing we can do to change history, and we all know that it serves no one to feel shame about the sins and omissions of our ancestors. But I know this. On Friday, Linda White Burrell saw the description of today's service and sent me a text message gushing about how much she loves Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. They share some common personal history. And Linda even reenacted Mrs. Harper's visit to the Unitarian Church in New Bedford during her lifetime. Linda was so excited, I suggested we do another service about the famous suffragist at another time. A service that would involve Linda. Who knows, maybe she would dress up again. The funny thing is, though, that I thought about talking to Linda weeks ago. But when I thought about talking to her, I also thought about how weird it would feel. I didn't want to sound like I was saying, hey, you're black. You must know this black Unitarian who died 115 years ago. There's something so cringe about that. Like, once again, we're expecting the few black folks in our midst to teach the rest of us about our shared history, as if it's not also white history. Here's the thing, though. We need to be able to have the conversation. We need to all know at least some of our history, including the uncomfortable stuff. And we need to all feel like we can ask the hard questions, even if sometimes we look stupid or feel weird in the process. Amen. And we need to know that when we make ourselves vulnerable like that, we actually become stronger in the process together. But that takes practice. It takes practice to build that kind of trust. That's why in a couple weeks, the Committee on Ministry will be leading that 2-hour worship service called Roots and Wings. The intention is for us to share deeply during worship about more than just our milestones and celebrations. The intention is for us to share our hopes and our fears, our vulnerabilities, our yearnings, as we continue to figure out how we want to be together in this world that feels as volatile as it did when Frances Watkins married Fenton Harper on the eve of the Civil War. We're going to do the hard work in that service of listening more than we talk, listening as action. I guarantee you that day listening will be doing something so that we may be guided by love in this journey through history in the making. Please rise now in body or in spirit